oysters. We all know how great they are. They're good for eating and sex, right? Myths aside, oysters are loaded with zinc, which is great for your fertility or your sperm count. Vitamin B12 to get you in the mood, and glucose to keep your energy levels up. Oysters are your one-stop party shop. Obviously, I love oysters, and while I'm eternally grateful for these familiar traits, it's the lesser-known oyster attributes that have really seduced me. I've been studying these magnificent mollusks for 6 years now, but just 8 years ago, I was training to be a geologist. I remember one day I was studying rocks on the coast of Iceland when I stumbled across a giant whale. It was long dead, it had washed up from a storm. This putrid mass of rotting flesh had me captivated. Rotting flesh was dripping from its flipper, exposing its skeletal hand, and I immediately noticed the similarity with my own hand. That was it for me, my light bulb moment. I thought, bugger geology, it has to be biology. And hopefully marine biology, so I can study whales and dolphins and sharks, all the cool animals. So when my supervisor suggested I study oysters, I thought, you've got to be kidding me. That is the least charismatic organism I can think of. But as soon as I started reading about these lesser-known talents of oysters and the intimate history that humans share with them, I realized there's a really big story here that needs to be told. You see, not that long ago, oysters formed tremendously large reefs along all the temperate coastlines of the world. Wherever the sea was not too tropical or too icy or rough, oysters would grow on top of one another to form reefs of tremendous size. In South Australia alone, we know there was 1,500 kilometres of oyster reef, with reefs extending up and down the East Australian coast and around Tasmania. The Great Oyster Reefs of Australia would have rivaled the extent of our Great Barrier Reef. For thousands of years, these reefs sustained coastal communities around the world. Oysters helped drag us out of the cave and down to the cove. A nutritious meat that can't run away, oysters likely fueled much of our early coastal migration. The traditional owners of this land didn't just feast on oysters, they fashioned knives and fish hooks from their shells. We know oysters were so globally important for so long because of the enormous shell middens we find dotting the coastline all around the world. These middens, basically deposits of used shell, could be up to 4 football fields in size, containing 14 million shells per cubic metre. That's a lot of food eaten over a long period of time. The oldest shells in Australia are dated to 9,000 years. What's astonishing to me is that 180 years ago, these reefs were carpeting the sea floor just offshore here, yet few people know that they ever existed. So what happened? Well, unsurprisingly, shortly after Europeans arrived, a wave of oyster exploitation spread out up and down the coast. With the early colonists struggling to grow crops, oysters provided essential nutrition. But they weren't just harvested for their meat. When you burn oyster shell, you produce lime, from which you can manufacture cement. Quite literally, colonial Australia was laid down with oyster cement. Colonial Australia was built on the backs of oysters. In fact, built in 1863, at the height of the local oyster harvest, there may well be oysters in the walls here today. 170 years ago, locals claimed that these reefs were inexhaustible. But just 30 years later, this ecosystem had completely collapsed. We dredged every oyster bed we could find. The industry was so boom and bust, it quickly became part of our forgotten history. Imagine future generations of Australians growing up blissfully unaware that the Great Barrier Reef ever existed. That is the reality of our once great oyster reefs. This loss was an environmental tragedy because the humble oyster is in fact an ecological superhero. Much like coral reefs in tropical seas or trees in a forest, oysters grow habitat within which other species thrive. Oyster reefs are like marine megacities of invertebrates, thousands of tiny critters living at really high density. These critters provide a lot of fish food, and many fish also lay their eggs and use the reefs as nursery habitats. Basically, more oysters, more fish in the sea. Oysters feed by filtering particles out of the water column, and as such, play a starring role in coastal water quality. And they're really bloody good at it. One oyster can filter about a bathtub of water a day. If you multiply that by the millions of oysters that make up a reef, then oyster reefs become the kidneys of our coastline, capable of filtering large quantities of our pollution out of the water column. We spend billions of dollars on wastewater treatment plants when oysters can do the same job for free. Oysters can even slow the rate of climate change because their reefs are a carbon sink. Atmospheric carbon dioxide gets absorbed into the ocean, and oysters use carbon to grow their calcium carbonate shells, locking up the carbon for the long haul. Putting all these services together, much like coral reefs, oyster reefs can build the resilience of ecosystems to environmental change. So we can think of their conservation as a sort of climate change adaptation strategy. However, in Australia, we've lost over 99% of our oyster reefs. In fact, there is just one reef left in Australia. And the story is much the same all around the world, with the vast majority of reefs either in a very poor condition or, as they are here in Australia, considered functionally extinct. But while this sounds all doom and gloom, and certainly it doesn't look good, today this is an opportunity. With our ever-building oyster knowledge and an impassioned community, we can give something really meaningful back to nature. The good news is sitting just offshore, about 80 kilometres from where I stand. The largest oyster reef restoration project in the world has just started here. Sorry, in the Southern Hemisphere, not quite the world. We're restoring 20 hectares of native flat oyster. That's 24 football pitches worth of oyster reef. We're dragging these oyster reefs back from functional extinction. How do you build an oyster reef? First, you find a site where oysters once thrived. Tick. You lay foundations. In this case, we're laying limestone, which is common on the coastline here. And then you breed millions of oysters in a hatchery, settle them on used oyster shell, and then we can swim down and plant those on the reef. In time, they'll grow and smother the reef. My role is to maximise the survivorship and recruitment of baby oysters to the reef. Some of the sexier science that we're pursuing involves manipulating the signals that baby oysters use to find their home. You see, before oysters are the familiar dormant cells, they are free-swimming little larvae in the water column looking for a place to settle down for their life. If you've ever snorkeled on a healthy-sounding reef, you've probably heard this. That's the sound of thousands of little critters going about their daily lives, living inside a reef. Incredibly, oyster babies listen for this sound. As they find a healthy reef and they draw closer, they sniff for other oysters to settle on. If one oyster lives there, it's probably a good place for me to live as well. Using underwater speakers and crushed up oyster shell, we can enhance these audio and chemical cues so we can get more baby oysters to settle where we need them most on the reef. Pretty cool. This exciting project really puts South Australia and Adelaide in the global spotlight for marine restoration. But really, from start to finish, this project is about community. The reef is there for community to enjoy. It's a recreational reef for fishing and diving. The reef wouldn't exist if it wasn't for community members speaking out about environmental conservation. And as a multi-generational restoration project, the future of this reef also depends on community support. So please, be vocal, get involved where you can, and enjoy the reef. If we get this right, this reef will be here for generations to enjoy. One last thing I'd like to say. Eat more oysters. They are delicious. Don't eat these oysters, though. We're laying them down for the future. Please don't eat these oysters. But our farmers produce beautiful oysters. And as brainless, filter-feeding, shell-building animals is probably the most ethical meat treat you'll ever eat. Enjoy some oysters today and feel the connection to the sea that has captivated humanity for millennia. Thank you.